This is the sew along for our Boxwood Quilted Bucket Hat sewing pattern. It is the perfect base to upcycle a quilt into a trendy, cozy hat. First, print your pattern, making sure it's to scale by measuring that test square, and then tile your pages together. You can overlap them like I'm doing or trim one of the edges. I tape together each row and then tape those rows together. Then I like to use a paper rotary cutter to cut out all of my pattern pieces. Here's everything you'll need: a quilt, lining, clips, rotary cutter, stitch ripper, pins, and a hand sewing needle and thread. So you're going to lay out your quilt and align your pieces. You just need one of each. And here's where if you want a certain motif or part of the quilt on a certain piece, you can shift them accordingly. Then using a rotary cutter or sharp scissors, cut out your pieces. You are really going to want to notch every single notch on every single piece. They're really key in sewing your hat back together. Then for the binding, to finish the brim, utilize the binding on your quilt. Stitch rip it and you have perfectly matching binding that's pre-pressed and ready to sew. Grab the lining and cut out just the body and the top piece. Also, make sure to clip into those notches too. To sew the hat together, take your quilted body piece and pin or clip the center back seam and stitch right sides together at 1/2 inch. Then press those allowances open. Now to the top edge of that body piece, pin that top pattern piece matching up all the notches. I first clip the core 4 notches and then fill in the clips in between. Stitch them together at 1/2 inch, and I find it easier to stitch with the body piece in the top layer on my machine. Now we're going to take our brim piece and we're going to finish each center back edge with binding. These edges can be visible from the right side of your hat. The brim is not lined, so I just like to bind them. So just sandwich your quilt in the binding and top stitch down in place. Trim those ends, and then while you're at the machine, stitch the center back seam of the brim right sides together and give a nice press open. Now we're going to sew the brim piece to the lower edge of the body piece. Match those notches and clip them together. Stitch at 1/2 inch with the brim piece at the top layer. Then press the allowances up towards the hat. Now it's time to finish the outer edge of the brim with the binding. So start stitching your binding a couple inches away from that brim center back seam, and we're gonna open the binding and stitch right in that pressed crease. And you might need to slightly stretch your binding to maneuver around the curve. Then once you're a couple inches away from that center back seam, stop stitching and lay each binding around and mark where the center back seam meets that edge. Now mark a line 1/4 inch away and trim each binding end. This makes sure that the binding seam is aligned with the center back seam and it fits perfectly to finish the edge of your hat. Go ahead and stitch those binding ends at 1/4 inch of seam allowance. Then I just finger press open so I don't need to leave my machine, and I stitch it right back on to my hat, right in that crease again. To finish the binding, I wrapped the other pressed edge around to the wrong side and gave it a really good press. I made sure the seam was covered by 1/8 inch, and I used pins to hold the binding in place. Now you're going to need to top stitch or stitch in the ditch your binding. You could also hand stitch it. I love how this finishes the hat. So now we're going to move on to the lining. Take the top and the body lining piece and first stitch that body piece right sides together at the back and press those allowances open. Now while you're at your iron, press up the allowance on the lower edge to the wrong side. Now take your top lining piece, matching up those notches to the lining body piece, and pin and stitch. Now the lining fabric can be a little bit less forgiving than the quilted fabric, so you might actually need to do some clipping into the body piece to move it around that circle top piece. Now you're gonna insert your lining, matching up the center back seams to the hat, and just at that 4 corners, do some hand tacking at that top seam. And then that pressed bottom edge, cover the seam allowance of the brim and pin all the way around. To secure in place, just do a slip stitch all around the hat with a hand sewing needle. And after that, your hat is finished. It's fully lined and fabulous. So cute. You can upcycle any quilt that you like, or you can try making your own little quilt. It's a really good way to practice your quilting skills, your blocks, or create something new. Happy stitching!